They called Evelyn Carter violent, but all she did was raise her voice to stop a toxic waste site from poisoning her black neighborhood. At 68, she stood alone in court, handcuffed and humiliated, framed by a judge who never saw her as human. But Evelyn never asked for pity. She just wanted justice on her terms. So why didn't she call her son a decorated Navy SEAL before stepping into that courtroom? What happened next made everyone in the courtroom freeze. If this story grabs you, share it with someone who still believes in justice. And now let's begin. They brought her in through the side door. No announcement, no ceremony, just the shuffle of old shoes against a polished courtroom floor. Evelyn Carter, 68 years old, hands cuffed in front of her cardigan, faded at the elbows, walked with the grace of someone who had carried far heavier burdens than steel restraints. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't have to. Their whispers filled the air before the judge could speak. "Is that her? That's the woman who hit a city official? Hit him. I heard she shoved him right in front of the council. No, she threw a chair." That's what they said on Channel 8. The judge hadn't even taken her seat yet, and already the verdict was being passed from row to row, traded like gossip over a fence line. To them, Evelyn Carter was already guilty, not because of evidence, but because she was there at all, handcuffed, dark-skinned, and silent. Judge Marlene Strickland, a woman known as much for her icy tone as her swift judgments, stepped up behind the bench. She looked down at Evelyn as though she were evaluating a stain on her robe. The courtroom settled into that unnatural hush, the kind that only comes before something cruel. "Mrs. Carter," the judge said, her voice flat, clipped. "Do you have legal representation today?" Evelyn lifted her head. Her voice when it came wasn't loud, but it was clear. "No, Your Honor. I'll speak for myself." There was a slight stir behind the bar, a few raised brows. A woman of her age accused of violence declining a lawyer. It was either foolish or defiant. Maybe both. "You understand the charges?" the judge asked, uninterested in the answer. "I understand," Evelyn replied, eyes steady. The charge was simple: on paper assault on a government official. What it didn't mention was the setting, a community meeting held in a tired municipal building where residents had gathered to protest a new waste processing facility. What it didn't say was that Evelyn had stood up during that meeting and challenged the city's decision to place yet another hazardous site in a predominantly black neighborhood. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't cursed. She had simply said, "You're poisoning our children." And when a staffer had tried to remove her, she raised her arm not to strike, but to protect herself. A camera caught it, just a brief clip, cropped and captioned by the local news. A grainy frame of her hand raised and a headline, "Community Activist Assaults Council Member." That was all it took. She stood now, not as a protester, not as a teacher or a mother or a neighbor, but as a defendant. The weight of the label hung heavy in the room, yet Evelyn didn't flinch. Someone in the crowd coughed. Someone else muttered something about entitled troublemakers. But Evelyn's gaze didn't drift. Her eyes remained fixed on the bench, on Judge Strickland, who was already reaching for the docket with the dispassion of someone swiping through headlines. Evelyn's wrists shifted slightly in the cuffs. She looked down at them, then opened her right palm. Nestled there, small and worn, was a silver watch. Its face was cracked. The band frayed, but the hand still moved barely. She traced it with her thumb, then tucked it back into her pocket. The judge never noticed. The room never noticed. But one person did. Leah Tran, the young court clerk, barely older than Evelyn's granddaughter, saw the motion and tilted her head ever so slightly. A detail, a flicker. The kind of thing you forget until it matters. Judge Strickland cleared her throat. "Do you have any remarks before we proceed?" Evelyn raised her chin. "Only this," she said softly. "I've lived in that neighborhood for 42 years. I've buried friends who couldn't breathe the air. I've watched children play beside dead lots and leaking barrels. And when I spoke up, when I asked for someone to listen, they gave me handcuffs." The judge shifted in her seat. "This is not the time for speeches." "No," Evelyn said. "That time passed a long time ago." From the back of the room, a voice low and tired spoke barely above a whisper. "God help her." Another voice followed. "They're making an example out of her." And still Evelyn stood. Not defiant, not broken, just present. Steady. as if she had waited her whole life for this moment not to fight, but to reveal what needed to be seen. Later, many would say they didn't know what was coming, that they couldn't have guessed who she really was or what she had left behind to stand there alone. But for those who watched closely, for the few who noticed the watch in her hand, the way she carried herself like someone who'd marched before something lingered. Not fear, not regret, conviction, because they didn't shackle a criminal. They shackled history, and forgot it had children. The projector whirred to life, lights dimmed slightly, and all eyes turned to the screen as the clerk hit play. Evelyn Carter's image appeared grainy, centered, and silent. She stood inside the town hall facing the council with a calm but firm posture. Her mouth moved, but no audio was included. The clip lasted just over 20 seconds. Near the end, a city staffer approached her. He reached for something, then Evelyn's arm shot upward. Abrupt, unclear, freeze frame, end of video. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. "That's her," someone whispered. She swung first. "Looks like she went off." Judge Strickland cleared her throat and leaned forward, her voice clipped and smug. "As you've seen, the defendant raised her hand in a threatening manner toward a public official in a government building. That qualifies under Section 19C as a misdemeanor assault." She turned her gaze to Evelyn. "Do you still intend to deny the charge?" Evelyn stood without assistance. She took her time adjusting her stance before speaking, not out of frailty, but precision. "I do," she said simply, based on what Strickland challenged. "The footage is clear." Evelyn looked straight at her. "The footage is cut." Strickland smirked. "Excuse me, you saw 20 seconds. That meeting lasted over an hour. And before I lifted a hand, he grabbed my wrist and told me to go home and stop embarrassing my kind." Evelyn paused, letting the words hang. That part didn't make the edit, did it? A gasp somewhere in the gallery. Judge Strickland stiffened her mouth, twitching just slightly. "Let the record show the defendant is now accusing a city employee of misconduct without evidence," she said quickly. Evelyn didn't blink. "I'm not accusing. I'm remembering." Leah Tran, seated at the clerk's desk, shifted in her seat. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Something felt wrong. The case file she had entered last week, she remembered the media file. Its metadata had shown 47 seconds, but this version was shorter, much shorter. She minimized the window and opened the archived logs. 47 seconds. Timestamp intact, but the court file presented today cropped to 22. Leah's throat dried. Her palms went cold. "Objection, Your Honor." Evelyn said, her voice firm now. "The video evidence has been altered. I request the full recording be shown." Strickland's eyes narrowed. Overruled. "The court has determined the current video sufficient to establish the facts." Evelyn tilted her head. "The facts? Or just the part you needed to feel in control?" Gasps again, this time louder. The bailiff stepped forward, tension in his jaw. Strickland's gavel came down once sharply. "One more outburst from the gallery and I will clear the courtroom." Evelyn didn't flinch. "You don't want the full tape shown because it doesn't match the story you've already decided to tell." Strickland's tone dropped. Cold. Flat. "You're in no position to challenge this court." But Evelyn stepped forward, slow and steady, wrists still cuffed before her. "You think these cuffs silence me? They only remind me I've been here before. Different rooms, same fear, same story." Leah's screen blinked again. A warning flashed, access to archived file revoked. Her heart sank. Behind her, her supervisor leaned in just enough to murmur without being heard by the judge. "Close the file, Leah. Do your job." But Leah couldn't look away from the defendant. Evelyn had turned now, facing the room, not just the judge. Her voice remained low, but every word landed with force. "I didn't come here to beg. I came here because I believe someone might finally listen. Not to my words, to the truth behind them." Someone coughed in the gallery, then silence again. Strickland rose to her feet, voice curt. "This court will recess until 1:30. Defendant will be returned to holding. We will reconvene with sentencing this afternoon." The gavel slammed again. Chairs scraped. People stood. Some walked out shaking their heads, but others stayed frozen in place, eyes locked on the woman being led away in cuffs. As Evelyn turned to leave, she looked not at the judge, nor the cameras, nor the press lined up in the back. She looked to the clerk's desk. Her eyes found Leah's and held. Leah blinked, just once, and Evelyn nodded. barely perceptible. As if to say, "You saw it too." Then she was gone. Back in the hallway, the guard beside Evelyn asked, not unkindly, "Why didn't you shout louder? Ms. Carter might have helped your case." Evelyn gave a small breath, almost a laugh. "It's not the first time the truth got edited," she said. "And the ones who do the editing don't need to raise their voices, just their pens." That line would stay with Leah the rest of the day. It wasn't anger. It wasn't grief. It was a lesson wrapped in a whisper, and it had just begun to echo. The afternoon sun bled through the high courthouse windows, casting long lines of shadow across the marble floor. Leah didn't move. Most clerks used recess to stretch their legs, sip burnt coffee, or scroll through their phones. But she sat still, eyes fixed on the desk where Evelyn's blue folder remained untouched. From the gallery, a quiet shuffling approached slow steps on polished tile. Leah turned to see an elderly black man in a faded army jacket, medals tucked away beneath years of dust and dignity. He leaned against the wooden rail, eyes locked on Evelyn's empty chair. "She still got that folder, huh?" he asked. Leah nodded. "Did you know her well?" "I knew her when she was still Evelyn Miller. Taught at Roosevelt Elementary, back when the roof leaked and the heaters didn't work. She brought her own books, her own chalk. Would stay till dark just to teach the kids whose mamas worked late." He paused, voice dipping lower. "Taught mine to read and to plant. Said food and words keep people alive in different ways." Leah looked down. The courtroom had its own rhythm, a cold administrative beat, but his words broke through like something warm and human. She hadn't expected warmth here. "Why's she alone?" she asked. The man gave her a long, quiet look. "Because people like her always are until someone needs something. And then they remember." He tipped his cap and turned to go, but not before leaving a single sentence that stuck in Leah's chest. "Don't let them forget her while she's still breathing." When Evelyn returned after recess, her posture hadn't changed. Still upright, still deliberate, still steady in her silence. But Leah noticed the slight redness at her wrists, a result of the cuffs that had stayed on too long, tightened too many times. Leah hesitated, then approached slowly. "Ms. Carter," she said, keeping her voice low, "do you mind if I ask something personal?" Evelyn turned her head slightly, eyes soft but unreadable. "Depends on what you're asking. Why didn't you ever ask for help before it got this far?" Evelyn didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out an envelope folded and worn soft at the edges. She opened it, revealing an old photograph, black and white edges curled. It showed her standing next to a young man in a Navy uniform. They were smiling, but there was pain beneath the pride, a quiet understanding that they'd both earned those stripes differently. She didn't offer the photo, just held it in her palm like something sacred. "I did ask," she said quietly. "I asked for help for 40 years. I asked when our playgrounds started rusting. I asked when they closed the clinic 3 blocks from my house. I asked when they put a liquor store on every corner but didn't fix the streetlights." She looked down at the picture. "I called. I wrote. I waited. They smiled at me during election years and walked the other way every day after. I asked. I asked like a woman supposed to, calm, clear, polite. Then I asked louder. They stopped answering altogether." Leah felt a tightness in her throat she hadn't expected. "So no," Evelyn said, looking up again. "I didn't ask this time. I stood. For a long moment, the only sound was the soft buzz of a ceiling light." Leah nodded, not because she knew what to say, but because anything else would have felt disrespectful. "What about your son?" she asked softly. "He's in that picture, right?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. She folded the photo with careful fingers, smoothing its worn edges as if sealing a wound that had never closed properly. "He told me once," Evelyn said, "that the loudest thing I ever taught him was how to be silent with purpose. I raised him to fight, but I didn't raise him to clean up after what people broke on purpose." She slipped the photo back into her pocket. "He offered to come," she added. "I told him no." Leah blinked, stunned. "Why?" Evelyn's reply was soft but carved in steel. "Because I needed to know I could still stand without the shadow of a uniform behind me. Otherwise, they'd say I didn't win. He did." Leah swallowed hard. The courtroom around her felt different now. She could still hear the voices from earlier strangers, assuming, judging, twisting the story into something clean and simple. But Evelyn was anything but simple. She wasn't loud. She wasn't fragile. She was deliberate. She was dangerous to people who needed the world to stay blind. A knock echoed at the far door. Time to resume. Leah followed Evelyn with her eyes as she returned to the defendant's seat. She didn't limp. She didn't lower her gaze. She moved like someone who had spent a lifetime preparing for this moment, not to attack, but to reveal. And Leah knew then what Evelyn had been trying to do all along. She wasn't fighting for sympathy. She was demanding to be seen. They gave Evelyn just 2 minutes to speak. 2 minutes to defend herself against a charge that could cost her the home she fought to protect and the reputation she spent a lifetime building. She stood with a calmness that unsettled the courtroom. Her cardigan hung loose at the shoulders, and her hands, though free, for now trembled just slightly as she held a folder documents from her community. Signatures, testimonials, health reports, evidence that something was deeply wrong. "I'd like to submit these for the court's review," she said gently, placing the folder on the edge of the podium. Judge Strickland didn't even glance at them. "This is a criminal hearing, Mrs. Carter, not a town hall," he said, voice flat. "This courtroom is not your soapbox." Someone in the back gasped, but no one spoke. The judge's gavel came down like thunder. Motion denied. The folder was pushed aside, not opened, not even touched, just swept away as if her voice and everyone behind it meant nothing. Evelyn didn't flinch. She just looked at the judge the same way a mountain watches a storm, without fear, without movement, just standing. Leah Tran sat still at her desk, but something in her eyes shifted again. The way the judge dismissed Evelyn wasn't just cold, it felt scripted, reflexive, like something he'd done many times before and didn't care to hide. After court recessed for lunch, Leah didn't follow the others to the hallway. She stayed at her desk, waiting. When the room finally cleared, she slipped behind the clerk's desk and opened the case management system again. She knew it was risky. But something about the edited courtroom video from earlier, it gnawed at her. Why did the file number change mid-log? Why was there no audio in the original upload? She tapped into the local network, navigated to the restricted archive folder, and found it. The original video, 37 seconds longer than the one shown in court. In those 37 seconds, Evelyn wasn't the aggressor. She was being cornered. She had raised her voice, yes, but only after a city official poked her chest and told her, "You people need to stay in your lane." That part had been cut. Leah hit record on her phone and backed it up to a cloud folder she created years ago, one labeled, "Don't Delete." Back in the courtroom, Evelyn sat quietly as the next witness took the stand. The pews were still packed mostly with people from her neighborhood. Older men and women. Faces worn by time and disappointment. Many of them had tried like her to speak up in small ways, letters, meetings, petitions, but were always told the same thing. It's too late. It's already decided. A woman sitting behind Leah wiped her eyes with a tissue pulled from her sleeve. The man beside her looked down at the floor, fists balled tightly in his lap. They didn't speak. They just sat there like people at a funeral who weren't allowed to cry out loud. The bailiff, a tall officer with arms crossed, never took his eyes off Evelyn, as if he expected her to snap, to scream, to rush the bench. But Evelyn simply breathed. She turned her head slightly toward Leah, and in a voice that barely rose above a whisper said, "Don't fight for me. Just don't look away." It wasn't a plea. It was a reminder of what silence does, of what watching without seeing has allowed for generations. Leah didn't answer, but her hand slid slowly into her pocket, closing over the phone now carrying the truth. As the judge called for a recess, Evelyn was escorted out of the room like a threat. She didn't resist. She only looked at the folder left behind on the podium, its pages fluttering slightly in the air from the overhead fan, as if still trying to speak for her. In that moment, it felt like something had cracked in the room. Not loudly, not suddenly, but quietly in the bones. Because what they denied that morning wasn't just evidence. They denied the weight of a community's pain. They denied history. And yet history was sitting right there, calm, breathing, waiting, because they had no room for her truth. But she was about to make room for theirs. The courtroom was silent in the way a room holds its breath before something cruel. Judge Strickland didn't glance up from her paperwork when she began to speak. Her voice, flat as stone, echoed through the chamber. This court finds the defendant Evelyn Carter guilty of assaulting a government official and inciting public disorder. There was a sharp intake of breath across the gallery. Evelyn didn't flinch. She stood with her hands calmly folded in front of her wrists, still red from the handcuffs they had just removed. "The defendant is hereby sentenced to 18 months in county jail," Strickland continued. "No option for bail." It was the kind of sentence usually reserved for repeat offenders for dangerous people, not for a 68-year-old woman whose crime had been raising her voice at a city meeting. A single voice cracked the silence. It was a woman near the back of the courtroom, gray-haired, trembling with disbelief. "She didn't hit anyone," the woman cried. That video was edited. Security moved quickly toward her, but she didn't sit down. "We were there. She was trying to stop them from poisoning our children. That's not a crime." Leah sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of her bench so tightly her knuckles turned white. She could feel the truth swelling in her chest like a storm. But she didn't move. She didn't speak. Fear, thick and choking, held her still. Strickland didn't acknowledge the outburst. She simply looked down at Evelyn and said with unshaken coldness, "You may address the court before sentencing is finalized." Evelyn raised her chin. Her voice was soft, but it reached every corner of the courtroom. "Even my silence," she said slowly, "seems to threaten you." Her words hung in the air heavier than any gavel strike. And then almost in a whisper she added, "That should scare you more than it scares me." The bailiff approached, placing the cuffs back on Evelyn's wrists with practiced efficiency. There was no protest, no struggle, only the quiet sound of metal clicking into place. As they led her out, Evelyn turned briefly just for a moment and caught Leah's eyes. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a look that said, "Now you know. What you do next is yours to carry." Leah felt the tears sting her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Not yet. Outside the courtroom doors, the community members who had come in, hope now stood stunned. Some wept. Others stood in stiff, shocked silence. One man pressed his hands over his face, shaking with anger. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, tugged on his mother's sleeve and whispered, "But she's the one who helped with my school lunches. Why are they taking her?" Inside the courtroom, Judge Strickland tapped her gavel once. "Court is adjourned." Leah still hadn't moved. Her fingers were still tight on the wood of the bench. She could hear her own heartbeat louder than the murmurs rising around her. Next to her, the defense attorney, an overworked public defender who hadn't said much during the trial, exhaled slowly and muttered, "That woman didn't need a lawyer. She needed an army." Leah finally rose. Her legs were unsteady, but her mind wasn't. Not anymore. As she walked toward the exit, her gaze passed by the defense table where Evelyn had left something behind. It was the same photograph Evelyn had glanced at the day before. A young man in full navy dress blues stood beside Evelyn, his hand on her shoulder, his smile quiet but proud. Leah stared at the photo. There were medals on that uniform. Real ones. Then she remembered the watch. The old military-issued watch Evelyn had looked at when the trial began. The one she wore like armor. And a thought crept into Leah's mind, slow and sharp. They think they've shackled a poor old woman with no power, but they have no idea whose mother they just sentenced. And this time maybe someone would listen. They were halfway down the corridor when it happened. Evelyn didn't stumble. She never did. But as the officers turned her toward the holding elevator, a small envelope slipped from the inside of her faded cardigan and floated gently to the ground. Nobody noticed except Leah. She was still standing at the back of the courtroom doors, half in, half out, her mind racing in 100 directions and none of them making sense. But when she saw that envelope land with the kind of softness that makes noise in silence, she stepped forward almost instinctively. It was cream-colored, unsealed, lightly folded. On the front, scrawled in black ink, were 6 simple words. "To Mom, I'm coming home soon." Below the signature, Malcolm was a faint pressed emblem. It took her a moment to recognize it, but once she did, her breath caught in her throat. Navy SEAL Trident. She looked up, but Evelyn was already gone. The metal doors had shut behind her with a sound that felt too final. Leah clutched the latter hands, trembling, and turned back into the courtroom, pushing past murmurs and side glances. At the defense table, she sat down, opened her laptop, and began to search. Malcolm Carter. She didn't expect much. Maybe an obituary, a local contractor, a pastor even. But the first image to load nearly stopped her heart. Malcolm J. Carter. Silver Star recipient. Former Navy SEAL. Current senior strategic advisor at the Pentagon. photographed beside generals, briefing with the Secretary of Defense. One headline read, "The Ghost Operative Who Redefined Modern Recon." It didn't make sense. That quiet woman in a faded sweater raised that. Leah stared at the photo of Malcolm in uniform, the same uniform from the picture Evelyn kept by her side. But this was no ordinary soldier. This was someone who could pick up the phone and shift a battlefield. Someone who could shake a courtroom if he wanted. But he hadn't come. And Evelyn hadn't called. Leah leaned back in the chair, the letter still open on her lap. Her mind spun between anger and awe, confusion and clarity. Why? Why wouldn't she call him? A voice from memory answered, soft but firm. If I win because of who he is, I lose who I am. Evelyn had said it just the day before, almost like a passing thought. But now those words weighed tenfold. Leah looked around. The room was clearing out. People shuffled in silence, heads low. But the letter burned like a secret in her hands. Not a secret meant to be kept, one meant to be heard. For the first time since the trial began, she realized Evelyn had never been alone. Not truly. She had been watched. She had been followed. She had been underestimated because she chose silence where others would have screamed. And still she chose dignity. Still she chose principle over protection. Not because she was weak, but because she had raised a man who could flatten this courthouse with a word. And yet she asked for none of it. Because for Evelyn Carter, justice wasn't something you demanded through power. It was something you earned by standing even when it cost you everything. They had already placed the chains on her wrists again. The metal clinked against her skin as Evelyn Carter stood motionless, her back to the room that had just condemned her. Her shoulders didn't sag, her head didn't bow, but something in the way she breathed slow, measured, unbroken, felt like the quiet before thunder. The judge's gavel had already struck. 18 months, no bail, for raising her voice. The courtroom doors were about to close behind her when they opened again, this time from the far end of the gallery. A hush fell. Not just silence, but a silence that felt earned. A silence that watched. A silence that knew. Boots touched down on the old courthouse floor, their rhythm steady, unhurried. A man stepped into view. He wasn't wearing a uniform, but the presence around him crackled like one. His coat was military green, zipped high at the collar. His jaw, sharp movements, precise. He walked like someone trained to finish what others feared to start. He didn't look at the audience. He looked only at Evelyn, and she didn't flinch, not even when he reached into his inner pocket and placed something on the judge's bench. An ID card, a dossier marked Confidential U.S. Department of Defense. And then he spoke. "That's enough." The words dropped like a weight in the room. Everyone stilled. The guards at Evelyn's side paused mid-step. Judge Strickland squinted, blinking like he'd just been struck by light. "Excuse me," the judge asked, voice too thin for a man used to command. The man stepped forward. "You've done enough damage for one morning, Your Honor." He didn't shout. He didn't gesture. But the control in his voice made even the bailiff forget to breathe. Strickland tried to recover. "This court is adjourned. Sir, if you have business with the defendant, you can—" "I'm not here to negotiate." The man cut in. He tapped the ID. "Malcolm Carter, Lieutenant Commander, U.S. Navy SEALs, Pentagon Attaché to Homeland Strategic Affairs." He leaned in just enough to let the judge see the silver seal trident on the card. "And that woman you just sentenced?" He pointed back toward Evelyn. "She's my mother." The gasp wasn't loud, but it rolled through the room like a rising tide. Strickland tried to steady his hands, but they betrayed him. "You should have disclosed your relation before speaking, and you should have disclosed the missing footage before sentencing," Malcolm said, his tone now steel. "You think justice is a performance, something you control from behind that bench? You think her voice was a threat?" He stepped closer. "She spent her life feeding children, not fighting wars, and yet you treat her like an insurgent. So let me be clear, sir." His voice dropped, soft but heavy. "You didn't just try to break an old woman. You tried to silence the generation that built your country from the ground up." No one interrupted. Not Leah, who stood frozen near the clerk's table, eyes locked on Evelyn. Not the officers who now looked anywhere but at Malcolm. And certainly not Evelyn, who was still watching her son, but with something unreadable in her eyes. Not pride. Not shame. Something deeper. Something like grief laced with grace. Strickland reached for his gavel. His fingers trembled. "This is inappropriate." Malcolm dropped the sealed file on the bench. "That's a request for judicial review. Backed by video evidence your staff ignored. signed by 4 federal attorneys and 2 Pentagon officials. He paused. We can open it here, or in D.C. in front of a live camera. Your choice. Strickland froze. The color drained from his face. The audience shifted in their seats, the weight of accountability sinking in. Then softly Evelyn spoke. Malcolm. He turned. I told you not to come. He didn't answer. But in his eyes, there was that same stillness she had carried walking in. And when he replied, it wasn't as a soldier. It was as a son. You didn't raise me to let people disappear quietly. Then he faced the judge once more. Reverse the sentence. Expunge the charge. Or answer to a country that still remembers who she is. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't need to. Because in that moment, silence said everything. And it was no longer Evelyn who looked like the prisoner. It was the man in the robe. The courtroom had never felt heavier. The silence after Malcolm's words still echoed as if the walls themselves hadn't yet processed what had just been said. Evelyn was frozen mid-step, her wrists still cuffed, her body still shackled, but somehow, the power had shifted. You could feel it. Judge Strickland cleared his throat, a dry rasp barely covering the tremor in his voice. I don't know who you think you are, sir, but this is a courtroom. You can't just barge in and— Malcolm didn't flinch. He reached into the inner pocket of his blazer, pulled out a slim folder, and placed it calmly on the judge's bench. That he said is an official intelligence review conducted at the request of the Department of Defense. Page 3 has your name on it. Leah stood from her clerk's seat before she even realized it. Her hands trembled slightly, not with fear this time, but resolve. And I've got something else, she said, voice firmer than it had been all trial. Permission to present an unedited version of Exhibit B, the security footage the court was shown earlier. The screen flickered to life. The first few seconds were the same the moment Evelyn raised her hand, but then the missing frames rolled in. There it was, the city official stepping into Evelyn's personal space, jabbing a finger inches from her face, raising his voice until Evelyn instinctively raised her hands to shield herself. A defensive motion, not an attack. The courtroom held its breath. Strickland's face turned an unnatural shade of red. This video wasn't— Where did you get— Leah didn't even blink. From the internal archive, where you thought no one would look. A man in a dark navy suit stepped into view near the back. He was lean, unassuming, but the badge clipped to his belt silenced even the whispers. Agent Tessa Morgan, FBI, she announced, stepping forward with a folder of her own. Per recent directives, we've been investigating complaints of judicial misconduct involving racially biased sentencing patterns. Judge Strickland. Your name appears in 4 separate reports, each involving black defendants, all lacking full evidence records. There was a gasp from someone in the gallery. A woman, probably in her 60s, stood up slowly. Her voice cracked. You sentenced my grandson, took him from me for 3 years, over a fight he didn't even start. Another voice followed an older man with a cane. You gave me 10 months for walking out on a traffic ticket. Said I looked like trouble. I still remember your words. Strickland looked around, his mouth opening, but no sound came out. The gavel that once commanded the room now looked small beside his quivering hand. Malcolm's voice broke the moment. There's a difference between law and justice, he said. You spent your career hiding behind one while avoiding the other. The judge's lip curled a last attempt at defense. This is outrageous. I won't be lectured in my own courtroom. You lost that privilege? Agent Morgan cut in, eyes cool as steel. You'll be placed under immediate review pending formal charges. Please step down from the bench. The gallery didn't erupt in applause. There was no cheering, no drama, just silence. Thick, reverent, emotional silence. Evelyn still hadn't moved. Her face was unreadable, neither proud nor vindicated. Just calm. The kind of calm born from years of surviving storms. Strickland tried one last time. You people think you've won something. That woman, she's not innocent. And then Evelyn spoke softly. Say it. Say what you're too proud to admit. She met his gaze. You never feared my hands. You feared my presence. The courtroom for a moment seemed to hold its breath again. Malcolm stepped beside his mother, gently reaching for her cuffs. A marshal, sensing what needed to happen, nodded silently and unlocked them. When the cold metal fell from Evelyn's wrists, it was more than a sound, it was a symbol. Something had broken, or maybe something had been restored. Leah watched everything, her heart pounding not from fear this time, but from the strange, overwhelming weight of witnessing justice. True justice. She looked at Malcolm, who now stood beside his mother like a silent wall, then back at Evelyn, who was finally free, though she had never begged for freedom. "I thought you'd be angry," Leah whispered when she came near. Evelyn turned slightly. Anger's a weight. Truth's lighter. It walks longer. The people in the courtroom didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their faces told it all. Shock, remorse, admiration, shame. The unspoken question that hung in the air was no longer what had happened. It was how long had it been happening. As Evelyn walked slowly out of the courtroom, one step at a time, people turned to follow. Not to leave, but to bear witness. Because something had shifted. Something they couldn't yet name, but they could feel it. Leah remained at the bench, staring at the empty judge's chair. Malcolm paused at the door. He glanced back once. His eyes met Leah's. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. But his look said it all. It's not over. Now it begins. And somewhere deep in Leah's chest, something old began to burn. The courthouse steps were packed with people. Some came out of curiosity. Some came out of shame. And some came just to stand close to a woman who had faced down an entire system and never once raised her voice. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions, pushing forward with microphones and wide-eyed urgency. "Mrs. Carter, are you planning to sue the court? Do you intend to press charges against Judge Strickland? Do you believe justice has finally been served?" Evelyn didn't stop walking. She moved with that same quiet strength, as if the noise simply didn't belong to her world. And maybe it didn't. It was Malcolm who finally raised a hand, not to answer, but to part the crowd so his mother could pass. His body moved like it had in combat, precise, deliberate, protective. But Evelyn's calm presence made even his military edges soften. A younger woman in a blue blazer ran beside them, phone in hand, desperate to keep up. "Mrs. Carter." One quote. Just one. "People are calling you a hero." Evelyn turned just enough to speak, but her voice didn't rise above conversation. "Don't make me a symbol. I'm just someone who refused to disappear." That night, the headlines screamed louder than she ever had. "Retired teacher. Exposes racial injustice in courtroom scandal. Son of wrongfully convicted woman. Revealed as Pentagon advisor. Judge under investigation for pattern of racial bias." But Evelyn. She didn't watch the news. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of warm tea, her hands still steady, her mind already elsewhere. Malcolm sat across from her, his military frame bent ever so slightly, as if the last few days had carved a new kind of weight into his shoulders. "They're offering you everything," he said quietly. "Legal support, a lawsuit, public backing, millions maybe." Evelyn looked up from her tea, her gaze clear. "I know. You have every right, Mom," he added. They'd back down. "You'd win this time." Evelyn gave him a look only a mother could give, a mixture of affection, patience, and a kind of sadness that didn't need to be explained. "I don't need her to fall," she said softly. "I just needed them to see." Malcolm leaned back silent, stretching between them. It wasn't that he disagreed. He just didn't want her to carry the cost of being the better person one more time. "You don't have to forgive her," he said after a moment. Evelyn gave a small smile. "Oh, I don't. But forgiveness isn't what this is about. It never was." Leah came by the next morning. She looked different, less composed, less polished. Something in her posture had loosened, as though she had finally exhaled after holding her breath for years. She sat beside Evelyn not as a court clerk or a professional, but as someone still trying to understand the ground she was standing on. "So what now?" she asked. Evelyn reached into a drawer and pulled out a stack of old flyers. Faded colors, hand-cut edges, titles like "Free Literacy for Seniors" and "How to Grow Your Own Garden" and "Understanding the System." A community legal workshop. Leah ran her fingers over the papers. "You kept all these?" "I printed most of them myself," Evelyn said. "You learn to stretch $1 when no one's investing in you." Leah looked up. "But you could do anything now. Speak on panels, write books, start a movement." "I will," Evelyn said. "Just not the kind that sells tickets." "So, what are you going to do?" Evelyn didn't hesitate. I teach. That's what I do. The words settled like warm rain, simple, unshakable. Leah sat in that stillness for a long moment before whispering, "They don't deserve you." No, Evelyn replied gently. "But maybe someone out there does. And maybe they're waiting for me." That afternoon, she walked into a small community center on the east side, one with cracked paint and a broken fence. A dozen chairs sat in a circle, most of them empty. But one little girl no older than 10 sat with a book in her lap and her feet swinging just above the floor. Evelyn took a seat beside her, opened a notebook, and started again. She didn't need a courtroom. She didn't need revenge. She just needed the truth to land in places where it could grow. And for the first time in a very long time, the silence around her no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a beginning. It didn't make the front page this time. There were no press conferences, no television vans parked outside, no heated debates on justice reform, just a slow morning in a quiet part of town where the sun hadn't fully warmed the sidewalk yet, and the community center smelled faintly of dust and old chalk. But inside, something was beginning again. The chairs weren't new, but they were clean. The floor still creaked in the same familiar way. And the blackboard, though a bit scratched, stood ready like it had been waiting for her. Evelyn moved slower now. Not because her body had given up, but because she no longer had to rush to prove herself. She had walked through fire and come out whole, not untouched, but whole. A few kids were already there when she arrived. Some had been brought by grandmothers. Some had wandered in on their own. One boy clutched a broken tablet. A girl held a notebook so worn its edges looked feathered. And then there was Leah, no longer the courthouse clerk, but something different now, something freer. She helped unpack books, arranged chairs, greeted neighbors by name. The fear in her eyes had faded, replaced with something steadier, purpose, maybe, or peace. They started the lesson with a poem. Evelyn read it slowly, her voice gentle but grounded, letting each line settle in the room like a soft truth. Then came the part she always loved most, when the kids began to speak. They talked about words they didn't understand, about how sentences could stretch or shrink depending on how you felt them, and about why some stories were told while others were buried. It was a little girl named Tasha who asked it. She couldn't have been more than 7, her braids tied with pink ribbon, her eyes wide with both innocence and something wiser. "Miss Evelyn," she said, "why did they put you in jail?" The room went still. Evelyn didn't flinch. She looked at Tasha with the same calm she had carried into court. The same calm that made cowards feel nervous and children feel safe. "Because I didn't stay quiet," she said softly. "No drama, no bitterness, just the truth, plain and steady." Tasha nodded like she understood something bigger than the words themselves. That evening, after the lesson, Leah stayed to help clean up. The sky had turned lavender outside and the city lights hadn't yet taken over. Evelyn walked to the back closet and pulled out a small box she hadn't touched in years. Inside was a candle. It wasn't fancy, just a simple wax cylinder with a short wick slightly dented at the base. Evelyn held it for a moment before lighting it, shielding the flame with her hand as she walked slowly toward the center of the classroom. No one said anything. Leah watched from across the room, her breath caught in her throat. Evelyn placed the candle on the corner of her desk. The flicker reflected against the blackboard and danced across the wrinkles of her face, catching in her eyes like tiny stars. And for a moment, the room felt like something sacred. It wasn't just a classroom anymore. It was a memory made real, a promise kept, a witness that the fight hadn't ended with a verdict or a news story or even a public reckoning. It continued here, in every child who learned to speak with clarity and stand without fear, in every neighbor who found the courage to look injustice in the eye and say, "No more," and in every flicker of light that refused to go out, no matter how many times the wind tried to silence it. Evelyn didn't say anything more that night. She didn't need to. The candle said it all. It burned quietly, but it burned. And sometimes that's how revolutions begin, not with noise, but with someone who chose not to stay quiet. If this story moved you, you're not alone. Evelyn's journey reminds us that silence can hold power and dignity doesn't need to shout to be heard. This wasn't just a courtroom drama, it was a story of quiet resistance, of a woman who stood firm when no one else would, and whose light outlasted the darkness around her. If her courage touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video. It truly helps. Share it with someone who still believes in justice and in the power of one voice to make a difference. And if stories like this speak to you, Subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories so you don't miss the ones still waiting to be told. Your support means the world to us. It fuels our team to keep bringing you meaningful stories, not just to entertain, but to remember, reflect, and inspire. Here at Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't just tell stories, we keep the memory alive.